Support for Lab Out Loud is brought to you by the National Science Teachers Association. Find out more at nsta.org. You're listening to Lab Out Loud, Science for the Classroom and Beyond. And today we're looking at what happens when teachers introduce controversial topics in the classroom and how it can benefit our students in the future.
You know, it's pretty important that students are able to have dialogue and discourse using science to support it in terms of a lot of these controversial issues. If we don't give them an opportunity to do that in the classroom setting where they are supported, where they can get feedback from one another and teachers in what we would hope would be a safe space, then it seems like we're missing an opportunity. And as those individuals find themselves out in society without having had that type of practice, it might be difficult at that point to develop those types of skills and dispositions.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud, but first, I'm your co-host, Dale Basler. Brian Bartel, my co-host, will be joining us shortly during the interview. But before we get started, I want to go through a few announcements. First up, the National Conference, NSTA's National Conference, is coming up in Atlanta. It is going to be on March 15th through the 18th. You are still able to sign up for that and register online. If you are thinking about going to a conference and you've kind of been on the fence and you're not sure, let me tell you, if you haven't been to an NSTA national conference, I highly recommend it. That first national conference experience is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. There's so much there, so many great guests, so many great keynote speakers. Former guests of Lab Out Loud are actually going to be speaking there. The exhibit halls, the sessions, the teachers you're going to meet, the common stories you're going to share, the things you're going to learn. You can't beat it. So keep it in mind. Science on My Mind is the conference theme in Atlanta, and it's, once again, March 15th through the 18th. Head on over to the NSTA website for more information. Another thing that we want to draw your attention to is the Lab Out Loud Patreon page. If you go to our website, laboutloud.com, you can become a Patreon for Lab Out Loud. And what that means is that you show your support for the show by pledging at the minimum $1 a month to say, hey, this is Lab Out Loud, we're going to contribute. And if we can get a critical mass of Patreons supporting the show, we can do different things. Some of the things that we're looking to do is to do some Lab Out Loud recordings that are on location. We're also looking at possibly doing some giveaways and having some specialized content that is just for our Patreons. Now, all of this, giving things away costs money, so we're looking to get a critical mass of supporters that can kind of get that community going. And you can find more about that at our website. Just look for the Patreon link. And then finally, another way to show that you love Lab Out Loud is to get one of our t-shirts. We have t-shirts now. They're at the website. They are through Teespring, and Teespring basically just creates the t-shirts on demand. And so you put your order in there, and then once the time is up, they send out a t-shirt. So you're going to go on the website. It looks like there's a countdown, like only have 3 more days to buy the t-shirt. That just starts over and over again for people. So your order can go through within 3 days of when you place it. And then they ship the t-shirt to you, and you can wear Lab Out Loud with pride, and people will stop you at science department meetings or science conventions or the grocery store and say, hey, what's Lab Out Loud? And it's another chance to talk science with somebody. So I hope you check all those things out. And now we're going to head into the interview, and it is a good one. I can't remember the last time or even if it has ever happened before, but we have 3 guests on Lab Out Loud. They have all authored an article, and the easiest way to get them on the show is just have them do a round-the-table introduction. So here we go.
Okay, well, my name's David Owens. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the University of Missouri. I work with Troy, and we do research in the area of using socio-scientific issues as context for teaching and learning.
And I'm Troy Sadler. I'm a faculty member and associate dean at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I work on science education. I'm a former high school science teacher and have been doing a lot of research related to how kids think about complex issues.
Well, I'm Dana Zeidler. I'm a distinguished university faculty in science education at University of South Florida. And I've been working with Troy for quite some time on socio-scientific issues, and more recently with Dave as well, too. So I think we've made a pretty good research team.
Excellent.
The conferences that you get together, you must get a chance to finally actually see each other face to face and connect that way.
Well, that's only once a year. That's about as much as we can stand of one another in person. But from a long distance, we work really well together, seamlessly.
Well, see some of the benefits of online communication, right?
Absolutely.
Well, gentlemen, your article in Phi Delta Kappa is what caught my eye, titled Controversial Issues in the Science Classroom. And Troy, you being a former high school science teacher, did you have experiences with this?
Sure. So when I was teaching high school biology primarily, one of the things that I liked to do the most in my classroom was to think about how to engage the students in issues and discussions that would really grab their attention, that would get people fired up about what they were learning. At the time, I just thought that we were having some interesting conversations or debates. Right about that same time, I started in a graduate program and ultimately started working with Dana as my advisor. And Dana was just beginning to put together the kind of what became the socioscientific issues research framework. And so I happened to start working with Dana at what turned out to be a really lucky time for me. The kinds of things that I like doing in the classroom that I thought were really meaningful for my students meshed with this kind of burgeoning research agenda. And so then Dana and I started studying how this works, how we can improve it, what are the kinds of things students learn, and just kind of took off from there.
Now, I see you mentioned collateral damage, which is a result of sometimes the conversation that takes place in a science classroom. What are some examples of what you meant by that?
I think that was your term, Dana. You want to fire off on that one?
I'm not sure if that was my term or not, but what we're trying to do is to take what children are naturally interested in and find ways to connect that to the real world, and in the process learn science along the way. We find that issues that have moral elements to them and ethical components to them are things that will attract students' inherent interests, and they're more apt to engage in dialogue and discourse. And by collateral damage, I think we're probably referring to the fact that we try to create a certain degree of dissonance, whether it's cognitive dissonance or moral dissonance in the students, to engage them and pique their curiosity about some of these ideas, these ethical issues that connect to the sciences that they really hadn't thought closely about, but they realize now that it affects them in very personal ways. So that's what we try to do, is to connect elements of the real world that have these moral and ethical implications and are embedded in the sciences and connect them to the lives of students.
Mm-hmm. You open up with the article talking about, in fact, let me quote you from it, whatever one's political stance or party affiliation, it may be tempting to argue that it's the other side that distorts and rejects scientific evidence. Now, you go on to tell us that it's not just one side or the other, as you kind of like teased out there. So what are some of those issues that you see on I guess, both sides of the political spectrum?
Well, some of the examples that we provided in the article included things like climate change, where generally, if you keep an eye on the news, you get a bit of support for anthropogenic causes for climate change from more liberal individuals, while conservative individuals often reject or deny that humans are really affecting the climate. And so a lot of times it seems like maybe conservatives might be responsible for, ignoring some of the scientific evidence that might contribute to environmental issues like climate change. But what we try to point out in the article is that, people who might be considered liberal also tend to avoid using evidence concerning issues that might be meaningful for them, like considering genetically modified organisms as being unsafe or needing to be labeled when there's not a whole lot of scientific evidence that would support that stance. So we try to use the article as a platform for suggesting that evidence can be used appropriately or inappropriate by anyone, and it's really that's happening more at the individual level rather than one group doing it all the time while the other group's doing it appropriately, if that makes sense.
Does this balance seem to temper, at least students from both sides of the political spectrum realizing that it's not just the other side, it's also maybe blood on their hands as well, at least in metaphor.
I think what it's enabled students to do, it's not that they're going to necessarily switch political allegiances, but I think the work that Troy has done and that Dave is doing now gets students to at least appreciate that there are other perspectives. And we
Sure.
begin to realize that everyone seems to want to confirm what they already believe to be the case, a type of confirmation bias. And I think, in the practice of having a civil discourse in a classroom that's facilitated by the instructor, students come to recognize that there are different viewpoints, multiple points of view on different issues, and they begin to realize that they have to offer backings for some of their opinions, and that's where the use of scientific evidence comes in. And I think we've been pretty successful at calling out different perspectives on these issues and having students understand some of the science behind those issues.
I noticed that evolution is not on at least some of your examples. Is there a reason for that? That would seem to be the poster child, I guess, and besides climate change.
This is Troy. On the issue of evolution, clearly the teaching of evolution has been a very controversial issue for science education for decades. It's an issue that I don't always think of as a classic socio-scientific issue, in that the controversy is really around what should be included in the curriculum, as opposed to controversy associated with the how the science is being done or how the science is being applied. And so if you look at evolution in comparison to the debates around climate change or the debates around vaccination or genetically modified organisms, it seems to be the controversy, the seed of the controversy, the focus of the controversy is quite a bit different. And so we have in our work, we haven't done a whole lot with the issue of evolution education, because it's really a kind of a curricular controversy issue, as opposed to the kind of moral and ethical questions around the use of the science, implications of the science, how we apply the science to those ideas in the issues that we tend to feature.
I see. So we don't argue about the existence of cells. We know that that's part of the curriculum, and we go beyond that. Right.
So the interesting questions around stem cells and the stem cell research are around what we should do with the science, what kind of regulations we might put on the use of stem cells in research. The controversy around evolution is really about whether or not we should include evolution in the curriculum. There's really not a whole lot of scientific debate around evolution. Now, there are some interesting questions around how some of our kind of specific explanations of evolutionary processes, but the big questions about whether or not evolution is happening, there's no controversy within the scientific community.
All right, so thinking about the socio-scientific issues approach, if a teacher wanted to start engaging in this in their classroom, where would they start?
So I think that process starts by the teacher kind of thinking about three things. Number one, what kinds of issues are of interest to the teacher, potentially to the students. Number two, I think the teacher needs to think about the content that he or she wants to cover, the standards that he or she wants to cover. And number three, I think it also the teacher also needs to think about the kinds of practices, activities, if you will, that they want to engage the learners in. So recently in our work, we've been thinking about we've been aligning our work with next generation science standards and thinking a lot about modeling and argumentation, for instance, as key practices. So as we think about selecting an issue that would work for our students, we also think about the content and the kinds of standards that we might want to address, and then we think about the kind of major practices that we want to support students in kind of developing and practicing as they engage in a unit-long exploration of a particular issue.
So you're talking about a model that has 3 phases then. Is that what you were going through?
So the model that we reference in the article...
the framework?
The framework that we addressed in the article is kind of you can think of it as a sequence. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, we've developed this kind of teaching framework. So for teachers who want to use this approach in their classrooms, we suggest starting the engagement of the students around encountering the focal issue, and then progressing to engaging in scientific reasoning and reasoning about the societal components of the issue, and then following that up with an opportunity for students to synthesize key ideas. So it's this kind of sequential sequencing of opportunities for to encounter the issue, to engage in reasoning, and that's where the scientific evidence is going to come in large play, and then opportunities to synthesize ideas and kind of bring things together.
Do you think teachers sometimes teach these issues and ignore the rest of the story, the views and opinions and things that they're learning from their parents at home and things like that come along with them, and they just kind of follow the curriculum or follow a particular format about the information, and they're not thinking about that? Or I just like your thoughts on that. Is this work as a response to kind of not thinking about the rest of the story about what your students are coming to the classroom with?
This is David. So it does seem like traditionally it might have been a little bit easier or more comfortable for teachers to provide a lot of the information in science practices as well that might not be so controversial, and that way they could avoid potentially having disagreements with students and or the parents, and even
we don't want letters back from the parents, right?
Well, I don't think many people would like to get those types of letters anyway. But one point we try to make in the article is that it's pretty important that students are able to have dialogue and discourse using science to support it in terms of a lot of these controversial issues, because those are precisely the things that people are expected to understand and deal with on a rational basis when they go to the polls or when they participate in democratic processes in general. And so if we don't give them an opportunity to do that in the classroom setting where they are supported, where they can get feedback from one another and teachers in what we would hope would be a safe space, then it seems like we're missing an opportunity. And as those individuals find themselves out in society without having had that type of practice, it might be difficult at that point to develop those types of skills and dispositions.
We've certainly talked with teachers on this show in the past that have dealt with those issues, those types of resistance, whether it was from parents, as we talked about, or even their own leadership, their principals or things like that, pushing back to what they're doing in class. Many teachers, I think, just as a safety mechanism in those cases, have driven, sort of taken a detour around those controversies. And am I right kind of saying that you're sort of suggesting that we steer into those controversies when it's appropriate?
Well, that is definitely what we're suggesting. And I think you can be successful when you do things incrementally as opposed to a wholesale change of your approach. And I think as long as you have a rationale of why it makes sense to include these types of issues with respect to student interest and engagement, and ultimately transfer of knowledge from one situation to another, and having students excited about what they're learning, is a pretty good selling point to both administration and to parents alike.
Okay.
So I also think that, approaching some of these concepts or controversies in that sense are preparing students for what they might face outside of the classroom. And in many ways, this might be engaging students more in the community around them, whether locally or, greater than that. Do you have any examples of that or anything to follow up on that?
So your interpretation, I think, is certainly in line with our thinking, that we really want the kinds of learning experiences that we are creating within classrooms to transcend the school walls. We want to get kids excited about thinking about science, ways in which that science can impact the issues and questions that they're addressing in their lives. And we also know that work of transferring ideas, evidence, thinking from a classroom setting to the real world, that's difficult work. And so we think provides all the more reason for us to create these opportunities for students to practice some of this kind of thinking and this kind of discourse, because it's the kind of stuff that they're going to need to do in their everyday lives. We do have examples of students engaged in these kinds of science classroom learning exercises and being inspired to apply those ideas in their communities. We see that as a fantastic learning outcome when they're able to kind of bridge those divides.
I would say there are plenty of times that we're introduced to scenarios where technology is going to help education. Some sort of savior that comes in and maybe it's a video series, maybe it's some sort of online course system. In many of those cases, though, the human element has been slightly taking a back seat. What you're describing really sounds like a very human endeavor that's going to be nuanced, someone who has to read the room, a human working with these students. This is going to be hard to do with a lot of heavy technology. I kind of feel like the dream class that's out there for some people. Anybody can speak to that idea?
Very, very briefly, what's interesting, we had one teacher that we've worked with who was an exceptional teacher to begin with, and he was a very traditional teacher and was an expert in technology and lecturing with great stories and great analogies. And when he began to use this method, it took him time to sort of, take the reins in a different direction and turn more control over to the students. And he said that it wasn't until he put away, the smart board and he put an old-fashioned chalkboard up in the room and he gave students, markers to be able to write their own ideas down and began to compare these ideas, that the whole classroom became transformed into a different kind of progressive classroom. The things that we advocate, are not completely new. They go back to, progressive education and inquire with students and trying to engage kids to think on their own and reason on their own. So in some senses, when we put some of the technology on the back burner temporarily, students became more engaged in the classroom practice of discourse and communication with one another. It doesn't mean that we rule out the use of technology where they can search for other ideas and other information, but we don't let that drive the curriculum. We let the students, as you said, this more of a humanistic approach, and the teacher and the classroom community be the driver for their education.
Mm-hmm. Good. I'll just throw out a little bit of a counterpoint. I completely agree with what Dana said there in terms of in that case with the teacher that we worked with that he mentioned. For him, kind of putting away some technology allowed him to connect with students and start asking students to engage in the kinds of thinking that was really productive. I do think that there are some technologies and some approaches to using technologies that may really help this work. Now, if we're waiting for a technology or a suite of technologies to come in and solve all the problems of the challenges of teaching, like that, I don't think that's ever going to happen, and that's certainly not going to be the solution. Or I don't see that as a way of kind of standardizing socio-scientific issues-based teaching. However, I think that there are some technologies, like some tools that might help scaffold students' argumentation, for instance, or virtual environments that might provide access to students dimensions of an issue that's difficult to make sense of without that virtual technology.
Help them with empathy, you mean?
Not even with empathy, but with
simulation.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a complicated dimension of the science underlying an issue that we might leverage technology to help students make sense of, so that then they have a better handle on why that empathy may be necessary in a certain situation, that's the kind of thoughtful use of technology that I would look for. I don't hold out a whole lot of hope for us to just kind of be able to turn over this kind of teaching approach to some technology that can be automated or something, or can be delivered through an online, completely online platform like an online course or something. Mm-hmm. But I do think that there are some emerging educational technologies that can be useful for supporting student negotiation of complex issues.
Even just communication technologies to reach out to professionals or finding information that might help support or even dismiss their own personally held beliefs as they're doing their research. That's, of course, not relying on the technology in the first place, but it's using the technology in an appropriate manner.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, when we work with teachers, one of the first things that we say is if you buy into this idea of teaching science with issues and through issues, then you have to be willing to walk away from a purely textbook approach, for instance, because much of the information around these issues is changing, and so the students, the teachers, are going to have to access that information where information these days is emerging, and so that we need dynamic forms of communication and information sharing, and then that feeds into another dimension of the work is helping students make sense of the vast arrays of information that are coming at them. So that becomes part of the responsibility of this teaching approach as well.
How do we assess this? And you can say that's not a fair question too, because I just feel that some listeners will say, great, but nowhere on our standardized tests is this going to be addressed. And so their time is always in constant competition against that measure. But can it be assessed, and can that assessment give it more status, I guess?
So I'll jump in, and then I'm sure Dana and Dave may jump in as well. I think it's, whether it's fair or not, it's an important question. The assessment question is really important. We know that's a huge a factor in determining what teachers do and how they make some of their curricular and pedagogical decisions. So the first thing that I'll say is that we actually have a fair amount of evidence that socioscientific issues-based teaching and learning can produce and does produce the kinds of learning that is valued through standardized testing. So we've done studies where we are engaging students in discussion of these issues, and they do just fine on the standardized tests, and in some cases better than comparison conditions where students are just learning the content. And some of that goes to, these issues and this general approach demands that students apply science ideas, and for some students, it's a much more engaging context to begin with. So
sure.
So there are some reasons why learning through issues can actually help test results. I mean, the other piece of my response, anyways, is that I think we have to start paying a lot of attention, more attention to what it is we're assessing. So if the question is, can students learn the science ideas that we tend to assess on standardized tests, the answer is yes. But we should also be assessing for other kinds of learning. So how are students using information? How are students arguing with evidence? How well are students reasoning? And so on that front, we've been doing some work around the development of new forms of assessment to track and make sense of the other dimensions of student learning that happens in SSI type learning environments.
I think Troy spoke eloquently to the issue. As he said, there are other types of outcomes that standardized tests aren't going to measure. And it's not that they're not important, but there are other things that teachers need to be concerned about beside how well their students do on standardized tests. So one argument is that in our work, we've shown that they are doing just as well, if not better, but at the same time, they're more engaged in science, their reflective thinking is improved, their sense of empathy can be developed. We've shown more robust outcomes in terms of argumentation and even more reasoning, and there are ways that to observe and measure these things. So the point is that there are other kinds of outcomes that we think are equally, if not just as important, in science education that teachers ought to be concerned about in their own classrooms. It doesn't remove the brute fact of standardized testing, but the fact is if students are engaged, they're going to tend to learn the content and learn it in more meaningful ways.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like we are gaming the system to, yes, we're going to learn the content, but we're going to do it in a sneaky way. But kids might actually enjoy it and get much more out of it, too. Before we let you go, do you see any pitfalls with this approach, or have you seen it used in a way that yielded some problems in how it was rolled out?
So I think one of the challenges is kind of foreshadowed in the assessment question. I mean, it takes time to do this kind of work in classrooms, and so we know through some of the research studies that we've done that students can and do learn significant science content when they engage in this kind of work. But if we have a semester of solid test prep versus a semester of issues-oriented learning opportunities, we don't have a head-to-head comparison of how well students might do on a standardized test with that kind of approach. So we do know that we won't cover as much content using an issues-based approach. But for me, the question is not just what we cover, but it's what do students learn and what do they become able to do by doing this work. I think that in the end, that students that have opportunities to thoughtfully negotiate complex issues, develop discourse habits, to be able to use scientific ideas, that's going to be a much more valuable use of time, even if we're not able to cover as much from a purely content perspective.
Do you have a sense of how much these strategies are being used currently in our schools? Let's just say our U.S. schools.
It's hard for me to put any kind of number on that. I know that when teachers are exposed to this, they're inherently interested in it. And I tend to find that teachers that come across my methods courses say things to me such as, I'm kind of doing this anyway, but I didn't know it had a name, and I didn't know there was these other aspects to it too. So we find that teachers who really, care to engage their students are doing elements of this. It's just it may not be done in a systematic way.
So we're targeting teachers to make this change. Are there any other places or people or positions that we can target to kind of introduce this idea?
In some of the most recent work that we've been doing, we've shifted from targeting individual teachers to thinking about teams of teachers or professional learning communities. So all of the teachers working on teaching biology in a particular school or in a particular district, so that then the focus becomes not just on an individual, but rather this whole team. Then we can also start talking with the administrators from that school and even from the district to provide a supportive environment. We know that doing this work well can be challenging. We ask a lot of teachers. We also know that it can be really rewarding and quite productive, but it takes support. And so for a teacher to manage this all by herself or himself, it's quite a challenge. It becomes much more doable when there's a built-in support network of other teachers that are committed to the same kind of vision and using some of the same kinds of tools. So we've found that kind of school-based approach or professional learning community-based approach can be pretty helpful.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. Thank you so much for your time, all three of you, Dana, Troy, and David, and we look forward to hearing from our listeners to see if they're implementing some of these ideas already in their classroom and maybe trying a little bit more in the future.
Thank you for this time to speak with the audience. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
If you'd like to learn more about today's episode, head on over to our website, laboutloud.com, for more information. You can also find details about all the previous episodes, and you can leave us feedback and comments. We want to hear from you.
If you enjoyed the show, make sure you've subscribed on iTunes, Google Play Music, or your favorite podcasting platform. And if you really enjoyed it, consider leaving us a rating or a review. Your feedback helps others find our show.
If you like Lab Out Loud and you love the show that we provide for you, please consider supporting the show at our Patreon page. Head on over to patreon.com/laboutloud for more information. Until next time, I'm Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.